Hi, and welcome to our discussion in this Guidehouse webinar series called Pathways to Resilience, Infrastructure 4.0. My name is Christine Richards, and I'm going to be your host for today's call, and we're excited to have you here. So today what we're going to take some time to talk about is hydrogen in the context of a net zero economy. We've really seen net zero emissions, looking at 2050 targets. I mean, those have really sprung up all across the globe. So we're going to take some time today to talk a little bit about what that fully decarbonized future looks like, the role that hydrogen plays in that future, and then how organizations can really begin to tap into hydrogen's potential. So before I introduce our great team of panelists here, I just want to give you a quick overview of the energy sustainability and infrastructure practice here at Guidehouse in case you're not familiar with it. So the ES&I segment within Guidehouse is a practice of about 700 consultants all across the globe, and we really focus on helping our clients and organizations build more sustainable and resilient communities and infrastructure. And a piece of this ES&I segment is the former Navigant Research, which is now Guidehouse Insights. So you'll definitely see that connection here within ES&I, and you can see all the ways that you can connect with us on social media. So we definitely invite you to connect with us and join in the conversation beyond just this webinar. So now we can go ahead and meet our panelists. We have a big topic today, a lot of different areas and directions that this conversation could go in. So I'm excited to have this set of panelists here to help with that conversation. So first up, we have Mark Eisenhower. Welcome to the panel, Mark.
Thank you, Christine. Glad to be here.
Excellent. And you're out of the DC area, right?
Correct. Born and raised in Virginia, still here with my family, and I've spent most of my career in around the Washington, D.C. area.
Okay, excellent. Well, it's great to have you here today, Mark. And just a quick question to kick things off. I mean, you've spent a lot of your career really working on, growing businesses in diverse markets, and it'd be great just to start out and hear from you. What are some of the biggest changes you've seen, when it's come to businesses and their approach to decarbonization? How have you really seen that evolve over your career?
Yeah, that's a great question, Christine. We were actually talking, Danielle and I were on a workshop yesterday talking to one of our clients, and she was mentioning all the changes and transition that she's seen in our industry. So I'm not going to say how old I am, but I've lived through gas deregulation, electric deregulation, seen tight sands come and go, seen the advent of shale, all kinds of remarkable things in the energy industry. And the one constant is change. And to me, it's very exciting the way that our industry continues to change. And I think the decarbonization challenge for our industry is very exciting. And I'm, really excited to be part of Guidehouse and work on that with our clients because I think it's something we should embrace. And I think it's to a large degree a great opportunity. And if I were, a CEO of one of our clients, I would certainly embrace the change and figure out how do we transition to that low carbon state, and how can we be effective and continue to have a vibrant company? And I think that's what stakeholders and investors are asking our clients to do.
Yeah, definitely seen a lot of traction there. So thanks, Mark. It's great to have you here. And next up is Kees Vanderloon, who is calling in from Utrecht, Netherlands. So welcome. How are things there, Kees?
Thanks, Christine. Yeah, very well. A lot of activity around decarbonization in the energy system here too, and increasingly also a role for hydrogen there. I myself, I'll give you some clue about my age, because I started in 1986 with a startup that later became part of Guidehouse, and been working on the energy transition all the time, but it's really speeding up now, and net zero emissions by 2050 is the official European goal now.
Excellent. And I mean, how are you feeling about that goal today, given all the changes that we're seeing, around the globe?
Would it be nice to be there before 2050? But I think it's really ambitious now, and it's the best we can do. Maybe when we get on the way, we find out that we can even accelerate more.
Excellent. All right, great to have you here, Case. And last but not least, we have Danielle Vitoff. And Danielle, I think you're calling in from Montana, right?
I am.
And I know sometimes I hear it's maybe not windy today in Montana, because sometimes when you have a lot of wind there, that can mess with your video. How's the weather there in Montana?
No, it's beautiful today. It's sunny out and beautiful blue skies today.
Okay, awesome. Now, just to get to know a little bit more about you, Danielle, you had noted in a recent post, when you graduated from college about 10 years ago, that you never expected to be talking about the clean hydrogen economy today. So, and here we are talking about it. So, what's changed, and what do you want people to keep in mind as we talk about hydrogen today?
Yeah, I think, I come from a different angle from a lot of people on this one. So I graduated college expecting to become an architect, and really have found my place working on decarbonized futures for utilities, cities, corporations. Really excited to be part of this storyline of how the energy system evolves. And I think in terms of hydrogen, we'll start to present this as we move forward. But it's really, it's a building block in how we think about the future. And, that's the piece I'm really excited about, is how do we layer those building blocks in? What's the value that each of them brings? And how do we use them to get to this low carbon future that we're all trying to move towards?
Excellent. I like that tie-in of architecture, building blocks, and seeing it all to come together. Well, it's great to have you here as well, Danielle. All right, so we've heard a bit from the team, and now we want to hear a little bit from you. So we want to take some time to get your thoughts on hydrogen, and hopefully that will help guide our conversation a little bit more. So what I'm going to do is bring up a couple of polls just so we can get some information from you all. And you should see a link in the chat box. And if you click on that link, you should be able to participate in this poll. And the first question we have is, when you think of hydrogen, what word comes to mind? Now, the way this polling software works is that if you type 2 words, it will show up as like 2 separate words. So if you feel compelled to put in 2 words, don't put a space between it, just put a period between those 2 words. So let's see what comes up. What's on people's minds? All right, clean. Is it gas? All right, let's see. We'll give it just a moment here. Okay. Seeing things around abundant. Yes, definitely. Someone got in 3 words. I like that. Next rising star. All right. Zero emissions, the mobility of it. And ultimately, the biggest ones are expensive, water, and clean. Okay, so we'll give people just a moment here. Any reactions from our panelists to what we're seeing?
It seems to capture the essence.
Okay. All right, so maybe we'll have to talk a little bit about that expensive part. See the storage piece. We'll definitely get into that. So this is great. All right, one more question, and this is going to stop people from entering it into this word cloud, but we'll jump on to the next one. All right. Now this one is a multiple choice. So when do you expect your organization to invest in hydrogen? You have the options of now, in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years, more than 10, and then never. All right. I always feel like I should have some music going along with this as it jumps up and down. All right. So we'll give people just a moment here. And Mark, while we're watching this come up, I mean, a lot of people are saying in the next 5 years, and you talked about a lot of change you've seen. I mean, does that surprise you that it's that high in the next 5 years?
No, not at all. I think it's a sign that people recognize we're undergoing change. I guess from my perspective, it would appear to me that the majority of Americans are embracing the move to the lower carbon economy. And the question becomes, how do you do that? I talked about all those changes that we've seen in the energy industry. And there's some things that we've done a very, very good job of. We've built a very reliable, low-cost energy system, one of the best in the world. But as we've gone through some of those transitions, we've made a few mistakes. We've had unintended consequences. And what we should be doing is using all that knowledge and all the information out there and looking at various scenarios, and then how do we best get to this low carbon future? What are the pathways? And as Danielle and Kay said, how do we deploy certain technologies? When do we deploy them? I'm not surprised to see the expensive word come up there. And then the question becomes, what type of structure, economic structure, do we put around some of these technologies, and what's the all-in societal cost of doing these things? I remember this famous meeting I was in, and we were talking about natural gas. It was trading about $12 a decatherm, and I was asking about buying some reserves, and the counterparty said, well, how do I know it's not going to 16? And here we are 15 years later, and it's $2.50. So, expensive to me is really, we need to take a step back and say, how does the technology fit, and how are we going to make all the framework, the regulatory and policy frameworks help companies make those capital investments to get there.
Excellent. Yeah, I really like how you brought up that framework, Mark, and really how does that look going forward, and as we kind of look to this net zero economy in 2050. Now, Danielle, I think just to kind of provide a little bit of vision and kind of understanding around, what does a fully decarbonized world look like, and how is it maybe different than a 50% decarbonized world? So I think getting that understanding of that bigger vision, would be helpful to kind of understand how hydrogen really has a role to play in all of this.
Yeah, absolutely, Christine. I think that's a really good question and a really good kind of foundational step here. And for those of you that read, I published a blog post just before this webinar that started to address this topic. But when we start looking at the mid-century goals, if the goal is just to get to something like 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, there's really technical pathways to achieve a lot of that with the technologies we already have and a lot of the business strategies that we already have. It's just about adding renewables and putting new things in the pipes and using a lot of the infrastructure we currently have. But going to a truly net zero decarbonized world is something that's transformationally different. And what we're going to see is that different sectors are going to use energy in different ways. And when we start to project this out, we see that there is really a role and a need for renewable fuels like hydrogen in places that are hard to electrify, things like industries, like heavy transport, even in backup for systems to provide resiliency to our energy systems and supporting kind of storage capability. All of those are critically important. That vision really transforms the way we think about business strategy as we move forward, and really defines a kind of new opportunity for a lot of technologies and a lot of solutions. So that's what we're thinking about when we're thinking about hydrogen. It's really a stepping block into a new vision, rather than just taking our existing infrastructure and moving it forward. And Case, I might pass it over to you and just see if you have some additional thoughts, especially coming from the European side, which I think is a little bit further ahead on this transition.
Yeah, thanks, Danielle. Yeah, I tend to think of it as the easy half and the tough half. So the first 50% is doable also within our current energy system, etc. The other half includes the segments that you already mentioned. And due to the fact that we now have consensus here of net zero emissions by 2050, everybody's sort of focused on seeing the whole thing in one go. So let's look at what it would look like if we think about 100% emission reduction by 2050, and it already starts to influence decisions now. So, for example, steel industry now runs on cokes and thermal coal, and that's not just as a fuel; it's also to reduce the iron ore, to get out the iron and to peel off the oxygen. you can try to decarbonize that by adding CCS, etc. But you can also think about hydrogen, because there's another process called direct reduction of iron. Then you feed in hydrogen, and you don't need the cokes and the coal anymore. So you don't need the CCS at the end of the pipe. And then the hydrogen, of course, should be decarbonized. And then there's two flavors. You can do that in the form of what we call blue hydrogen. So that's low carbon hydrogen made from natural gas. And then you add the carbon capture there. That's much more efficient, much more cost efficient than to have it at the end of the pipe. Or you can take green hydrogen, and that's made from renewable electricity by means of electrolysis. So in this way, you start thinking of, okay, so how can I decarbonize my steel industry? And you end up in renewable electricity via hydrogen, and you end up thinking about, okay, so how can I fit that into the infrastructure? And what we're doing at present is seeing if the gas infrastructure can't play a role there, if you can't connect sources of clean hydrogen to demand, for example, in steel industry, by means of converted natural gas pipelines. So this whole system thinking is starting to become a big thing here in Europe at the moment.
Excellent. Thanks, Kees and Danielle. I mean, I think you've really highlighted some of that vision and what it can ultimately look like, and how hydrogen starts to fit in. But I mean, there are certainly challenges to being able to reach that future. And it'd be great to hear just a little bit about, what are some of those key challenges? I mean, Kees, you mentioned the easy half and the hard half. And Mark, I'd love to start with you. I mean, what are the biggest challenges you're seeing to really get to this future that we're talking about?
Sure. So maybe Christine, I might offer the utility perspective here, right?
Yeah.
And if you think about the regulatory climate that the utilities find themselves in, where they're operating day to day and how they deploy capital, the stakeholders in that process want low cost, want reliability, want low risk. And in return, investors have gotten a relatively low but steady yield. So now, as you think about embracing new technology, you're asking to change the behavior, right? Change the behavior of really all the stakeholders, the policymakers, the regulators, the companies themselves, the investors. We're asking these companies to take more risk, asking them to embrace technologies that are going through change. If we encourage them to make these investments, we can drive the cost curve down, similar to what we've done with renewable power generation. But we need to change that environment if we expect people to change their behaviors. And when we talk to our clients, with almost to a client, we're finding that they are ready and willing to make that journey to the mid-century decarbonization goals, but the structure and the framework around them limits the change in behavior. So I think that's where we need to focus.
Yeah, I like that around. Yeah, I mean, it's that behavior piece. And like you talked about earlier, Mark, I mean, just all these other changes that have been going on in this industry, just kind of like here's another, wave of change that's coming. You mentioned the technology, Mark, and I'd be interested in getting Kees's perspective around that in terms of, what are some of the big challenges that may be facing us, moving towards this kind of 2050 vision. I mean, what are some of the technology challenges that we're seeing in being able to do that?
Yeah, to stay at the hydrogen production side. So that would be blue hydrogen. It would be introducing carbon capture and storage. Well, the technology is actually easier than for carbon capture and storage on the smokestack of a power plant, because the CO2 that comes from hydrogen production based on natural gas is much more concentrated, so it's easier to capture, but you still have to bring it to, for example, depleted gas field to store it for thousands of years. So technology challenge is not like we need new technologies, but we need to deploy them at scale. And the infrastructure for CO2 is not just a copy paste of a natural gas infrastructure. So there's some issues to solve, but that's more like organizational, logistical, and of course it adds cost. So you'd need a carbon price to get that going. Carbon price of like $50–$60 per ton of CO2 would drive it. Of course, you can resolve it. You can finance it in many ways, but just to give you an order of magnitude. The green hydrogen is a bit of a different story. Electrolysis is also well known, but hasn't been applied a lot to make hydrogen from water. It's mostly used in the chlorine industry now to transform salt into chlorine. So it is an industry that has skill, but it is never focused on this application. So typical electrolysis units now are like a megawatt, and we would like to go to the gigawatt scale, let's say by 2030 or so. So that's a factor of 1,000 ramp up. And in the meantime, you'd want to drastically reduce the cost, because I already saw the word expensive pop up big time. At present, that's true. Like green hydrogen would maybe be 5 times more expensive than what we call gray hydrogen, so the stuff without carbon capture and storage. It would even be, I don't know, 8 times more expensive than natural gas if you would care to replace that. But there's an enormous potential. First of all, the feedstock is becoming cheaper every day, so the solar PV installations and offshore wind, dramatic cost reductions on the feedstock side, but also the electrolysis shows a huge potential. You'd pay like $500 per kilowatt maybe now, or 600 for a decent size installation, if there were any. But you'd want that to go to 100 or 200 in the coming decades. And then you have a breakthrough, because then it becomes pretty affordable in comparison, first of all, to gray hydrogen, because there's already hydrogen use in the economy right now, like in refineries and fertilizer production, but then also to replace natural gas in the end, because we need to find a way to decarbonize that as well. And in some applications, the green hydrogen could be a replacement there that can deliver emission reduction at a relatively modest cost.
Yeah, so I mean, definitely what I'm hearing is that a lot of it is about, scaling some of this, the infrastructure and the technology is really needed to support this.
Yeah, so this was the generation side, but you also have to get it from A to B, of course. So there's more, and you have to develop the storage. It's a huge advantage that you can store it. Like if you have an excess in renewable electricity production in some hours, you can convert it to hydrogen. Then you have a way of storing it for much longer at a lower cost than a huge amount of batteries. But also there's some development to do.
Excellent. Now Danielle, I'm going to turn over to you a little bit here. I mean, we've talked about the different types of hydrogen. We've talked about the framework, about the technology. I mean, can you bring a perspective around, more kind of the federal, state policy levels, and provide some details there, because I think we're looking really big picture, but a lot of times, it happens more at that regional level.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a really important point here in the U.S., right? Europe is a little bit more everyone's agreeing to head in one direction, where in the U.S. our climate policies are all over the map. In case I think there's all kinds of stories there we can tell. But what I think is a really interesting story for hydrogen and the opportunity for hydrogen is that when we look at the map across the U.S. of who's moving fastest on some of these renewable and low carbon economy sort of storylines, it's been some of those states that really have either kind of the political means or the resources to get there. And when we think about hydrogen and some of these other building blocks, they become really something that can be jumped on by those that may not be as politically focused on kind of the low carbon kind of storyline. There's a lot of oil and gas producers, oil and gas businesses that really are starting to see opportunities here. There's infrastructure that can be reused. And there's some really interesting kind of places we can start to look across the country and say, there might be a real opportunity for hydrogen to be a big part of the storyline of decarbonization in this place. And what I'll bring up is kind of an example, and not necessarily saying there's more action here than somewhere else, but if you look, for example, at a state like Texas, right? Texas is not necessarily seen as the cutting edge of decarbonization policy, even though every single one of the large cities in Texas now has a decarbonization target that's pretty close to, or if not in line with, Paris Climate Agreement. But there's a lot of the economy that's focused on oil and gas, right? So their decision in terms of how they're going to transition is going to look different than other parts of the country. But the other advantage they have in Texas is they have a lot of wind energy, right? Because that resource is available. And that really is kind of a location where you could see the pieces start to line up to say there might really be an opportunity for clean, green and blue hydrogen to be developed in this space, and whether it goes into the systems and runs the businesses, in that part of the country, gets transported somewhere else, that is kind of a location that you can look and say, there's a real opportunity here.
Yeah, I definitely could see that, and now I think we're starting to kind of move into that conversation around the the value of hydrogen, in this decarbonized future. So we're having a lot of really good questions come in that are a little bit more specific around some of the delivery, storage, and transportation of hydrogen. But before I jump into that, I also want to just talk a little bit about kind of the value of the hydrogen more broadly. So Danielle, I mean, you talked about some of the oil and gas companies. Mark, it'd be great to hear from you kind of that utility perspective. What's really the value of hydrogen for utility companies at this point?
Well, I think, Christine, that the hydrogen is part of that transition to decarbonize the commodity in our pipeline infrastructure. And one of the things that Case's team has done in our Gas for Climate work is we've looked at a number of different scenarios, and one of the most compelling scenarios is how complementary the pipeline infrastructure can be to this low carbon future, right? So then the question becomes, how do you, and I see there's some questions from the audience around the pipeline question. We can begin that transition with renewable natural gas, hydrogen-enriched natural gas, to start to decarbonize that commodity that runs through the pipeline infrastructure. Ultimately, what the Guidehouse reports are showing is that we will have both be able to utilize the existing infrastructure and then have standalone hydrogen distribution systems. So it'll be a combination of the two, but it's really compelling when you look at the cost of that, because we're reusing these long-lived assets that we put so much capital behind, and the utility companies have made such good investments in, and it's really decarbonizing the content of what that transportation system offers. So I think that's one perspective that you would expect from our utility clients.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. And I mean, Case, as you talked about earlier, it's that kind of scale up challenge. So being able to use some of that existing infrastructure would be great. So Case, I guess a couple of questions for you. Mark was just talking about reusing natural gas lines. H2, the molecule is definitely smaller. So what does that look like in terms of kind of the technical aspects of being able to reuse some of the natural gas pipelines, and how does that change as it shifts more fully over to hydrogen?
Yeah, thanks for that. At the moment, we are working on a really cool project with 11 European gas transport companies. So they own these large gas transport pipelines, and they're thinking about their role in this energy transition. So what we're working on with them is what we call a European hydrogen backbone. So a main infrastructure to get hydrogen from the supply to the demand, so that you can serve industrial demand in Germany with green hydrogen produced by solar PV in Spain, and that you can take blue hydrogen from the Netherlands inland as well, so that you can create a real hydrogen market. And what we found, what the transport companies, the TSOs found actually, is that most of their pipelines are suitable for hydrogen. So it depends on the gas quality, on the steel quality rather. So, but the quality used for these high pressure pipelines is such that they can handle hydrogen as well. So it's not in the pipelines itself. You might want to apply a coating on the inside for some optimization, but even that is not strictly necessary. The big cost item there is the compressors, because hydrogen is really different in terms of compression. It has a lower energy density. You want to make it flow a little bit faster. It's also a different molecule. So the main investments are in compressors there, but still you get to a very reasonable cost for very large transport capacity. And just to give you an indication, what we find now, and we hope to launch this report at the end of next week, but is that the main pipelines that are in place for European natural gas transport, they have diameters of like 36 to 48 inch, that they can handle something like 10 gigawatts of hydrogen. And if you compare that to what the electricity grid can handle, that's huge. The state-of-the-art high-voltage DC connection can transport 1 gigawatt of electricity. And here we have existing pipelines that can do on the order of magnitude of 10. So there's a huge potential, and we very much look forward to publishing a first map of how that backbone could look in 2030 and 2040, and with a cost estimate attached to it.
Okay, excellent. So yeah, I mean, it definitely seems like there are opportunities, and again, investments that happen. Did anyone else want to add, comments around kind of that piece of reusing, the natural gas pipelines? I know we've had a ton of questions around that. So any other perspectives, Danielle or Mark?
Maybe Christine, just and I thought I can't remember whether it was Danielle or Case brought it up earlier, but one of the benefits of hydrogen is the ability to store it. And when you think about the overall resiliency of the energy system, right? And that's usually something that doesn't get discussed. We talk about reliability, we talk about other factors like cost, but we overlook how important resiliency is. How do we respond from climate change and material events, whether they're man-made or made by nature? And when you think about the ability to store this product, to be able to have long duration use of it when you need it, to be able to have seasonal storage in those markets where the seasonal changes are so difficult to overcome with straight electrification. So the ability to store hydrogen in these hydrogen networks that Case has described, and how that complements the resiliency of the entire energy system is a critical component to why we should embrace hydrogen as part of the transition to these mid-century goals.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that resiliency piece is huge. And we did have an audience question come in, asking, have public service commissions, have you seen them being willing to support recovery of hydrogen spending in the US? And what's really the key selling point that for these public service commissions to potentially support it? Danielle, do you have anything you want to add or talk about there in terms of those commissions and what you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I can give a quick overview, but I would say that, in a general sense, the regulatory boards are a little bit behind here. And that's common, that's across all the pieces that we see in kind of this transitional discussion. The real issues that come up is that, moving into these more transitional strategies requires a different consideration of how we manage rates, how we manage structures for spending in utilities. And that's a bigger question than just, are we going to invest in hydrogen? If we look across the US, particularly in the US, we have seen a little bit more of a focus from regulatory structures on electrification. I think that's simply just because it's easier to wrap people's heads around and kind of handle some of those structures that come along with it. It's kind of adding to the system rather than reusing existing systems. But we're also starting to see some of those case studies come through that are going to allow regulatory commissions to start to see these kind of examples presented. And so the one I will bring up is the fact that LADWP made the decision to make a significant investment in hydrogen, basically generation assets. They're starting with a facility that's mostly going to be natural gas, but has the capability to move to hydrogen, because they basically looked down the line and said, we will not meet our carbon targets without including hydrogen. And so as we start to see more of those kind of case studies come through, I think we will see the regulatory boards change and really start to see opportunities to look at different business structures and regulatory structures that may allow for these solutions.
All right. Yeah, I mean, it definitely seems like you said, Danielle, seeing those case studies and understanding that will be really important for these commissions. Now, case, I'm guessing that's not the case in Europe. I mean, what are you seeing there in terms of that support for hydrogen and kind of those case studies? How much does that really play a role?
Well, the support is rapidly growing. So even yesterday, the European Commission published its hydrogen strategy, really putting it in a central place in the whole energy transition in the European Green Deal that we're preparing here. And it has very, very ambitious goals, like 40 gigawatts of electrolyzers already by 2030. So it calls for a fast ramp up, and of course we need much more decisions also by member states to turn this strategy into an actual policy and then into actual action on the ground. But it looks good, and there's quite a few countries also behind this. The Netherlands is my own country, is very active with its hydrogen policies. But Germany, for example, which was until recently pretty skeptic, has also published now its hydrogen strategy, and also sees a lot of opportunities also for its own manufacturing industry in the equipment manufacturing, but also for the industry as a user, perhaps also for imports in that case. So growing sports, of course, also skepticism. I've seen some comments also in the questions from the audience here. It has to prove a lot. It has to prove that it can do cost reduction. It has to prove that it can be really clean. CCS, carbon capture and storage, was just described by one of the people in the audience as the eternal promise, always 10 years away. Well, I can say that has something to do with the fact that we tried to start at the hard side. So in the combustion gases of a power plant, the CO2 content is not that high, and it's pretty hard to capture it and to scrub it out of all the rest in those gases and to then store it. So carbon capture on hydrogen production will happen. It's much easier. It's much more cost efficient. But we need some proof. So here as well, we need those practical projects to get off the ground. But they're now rapidly being developed. There's one of the a big blue hydrogen project is this year on the verge of getting its final investment decision in the Port of Rotterdam area. And there's many green hydrogen projects being announced. There's also a support scheme in various countries already. So I believe this will actually happen, and then we'll see whether those promises are made true. But so far, yeah, I would say forecasts are even improving. We see much more perspective for cost reductions than we saw just 2 years ago.
Excellent. Definitely the progress being made there as well. Now, I mean, Mark, just kind of jumping back to the U.S. conversation and the the value of hydrogen and the regulatory structure and all that. I mean, how are you seeing it? Maybe the differences between primarily electric utilities versus natural gas utilities. I mean, what are you seeing there in terms of differences between those types of organizations?
Yeah, it's a good question, Christine. When you look at the utility industry, there's very few standalone natural gas utilities, and the majority of them, of the natural gas utilities, are part of larger companies that have both power and gas. And so that's why I say, when we talk to our clients, they seem so committed to this decarbonized future because it's important to them because they have investments in both segments, on their balance sheet. So, but I do see questions coming from the audience in terms of challenging, can we really get there? Do the utilities really want to make these changes? And, when we look at the research that Guidehouse has done, all of the work that we do, we look at various scenarios. And again, we're doing this to try to flush out unintended consequences, right? And to think through how complex these issues are. But the scenarios are driven by fundamental drivers. And so one of the questions that the audience is asking is, do we have enough renewable resource in order to make this conversion to green hydrogen in particular? And our view is that we are on the path to materially increase the amount of renewable generation in this country. One example is New York, and Danielle can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the goal is 100% renewable by 2040. So you're seeing the policymakers step out and set the goals that they want the companies to follow. And then the regulators, their job is really to put those policies into play. We shouldn't expect our regulators to make that policy. The policy should be, the communities in which we live and the other stakeholders who feel the importance of the journey to the mid-century goals.
Excellent. Yeah. So I mean, definitely seeing that growth and change happen. We've also had some questions coming in. So we've talked about a lot of the the benefits and opportunities, and we had an audience member who had a question around a follow-up question around the regulatory side. So definitely there are benefits out there, but also potential concerns. And it was brought up that lithium-ion batteries and some of the concerns there. So what are we seeing in terms of concerns around hydrogen, and what can we do to be addressing those concerns? And Danielle, I'll pick on you first for this one.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I would say that as we look today, that kind of story of health and safety and how we're like fire departments responding or police departments is pretty new for the hydrogen storyline. And that's just because of where hydrogen's being used. We are not necessarily putting hydrogen in pipes today and pushing it out to homes and businesses in a lot of communities. The idea is that we may use in the future, hydrogen-enriched natural gas may be something that we use, but pure hydrogen is not going to be flowing into people's homes, right? And so we see a little bit less of a pushback, but I also think that this brings up the storyline of engaging stakeholders is important for this transition. I mean, I know an example where working on a city climate action plan, there was a really big push against like the lithium-ion batteries from the fire department. Come to find out that, the person that was really making the push had a friend who was hurt in an explosion related to a lithium-ion battery, right? And we're going to see those same sort of pushbacks from hydrogen. I think what we often forget to remember is that those same storylines exist for the electricity that powers our homes today and the natural gas, but we just take that as part of doing business. So as we continue to think, ourselves and how we help encourage this transition, we need to think through who are the stakeholders that are involved and how do they play. I think where we're going to start to see this story come up more is a little bit less around the U.S. regulatory kind of utility regulatory side, but more around the transportation. We are definitely going to start to see as we see more hydrogen-powered vehicles, that concern from stakeholders of what does that mean for their safety, on the road.
Yeah, I really like how you frame that, Danielle, of, because it's something new, people are really trying to sort out, what does this really mean? But, we have those things that are around us that can potentially be dangerous every day, like electricity or natural gas, but it's just part of our world. So we are better at accepting some of those risks than with a newer technology. All right. So one other thing that I'd like to shift focus on, we've had several questions around really the transportation of hydrogen, and what that looks like and what that involves. And one question that someone had was around, how far does hydrogen really go out into the community? And it sounds like, from what you said, Danielle, it's not necessarily going to go down to the household level. I mean, where is kind of the hydrogen really going within this infrastructure? And in case, if you can tackle that and talk a little bit more about that, that'd be great.
Yeah, so what we see in our analyses, indeed also for the Gas for Climate project, is some very large users like industrial sites and power plants, etc. And they can just tap into the transportation grid, so into the backbone to the large transport pipelines. It is, of course, more complicated if you would like to bring hydrogen to buildings and to homes. Some utilities in the UK are working on that, but then you have to change also the last mile of your pipelines, which may be different materials. You have to change metering devices in the homes. You have to change people's gas-fired boilers, even if they become part of a hybrid heat pump system. They can't just keep their old gas-fired boiler and add a heat pump, but they have to do something about the boiler as well. So that makes it a lot more complicated. That's why for Europe we find that hybrid heat pump is a really good solution. You save a lot. Society saves a lot on insulation costs for the cold spells. If you want to do that all electric, then you really have to insulate very well. You save on the dimensions of the heat pump and of the electricity connection and on the reserve capacity in the electricity system. So that's a good thing. But we would try to use biomethane for that, so renewable natural gas, because then you don't have to change all those little things at the end of the pipe. So you don't have to change the last mile of the distribution grid and the connection and metering device and the gas-fired boiler. So it's supply constrained, so you don't have endless supply of biomethane, sustainable biomethane, but there's a lot to go around, and it's enough to provide the modest quantities of gas that you need to help the heat pump when it gets really cold. So that's how we would try to simplify matters, by not choosing the hardest part to introduce hydrogen. Yeah, I think that's basically the story. So try to use it at the high pressure side of the network, and only if it is really super attractive, or if there's no alternative, bring it downstairs.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean that more local distribution of hydrogen, seems to be an important aspect, but there's also the global piece of it as well. I mean, this is truly, going to be like a global marketplace for hydrogen. And I guess, Mark, I'd start with you. I mean, what are you seeing in terms of things in the U.S. and perhaps utilities and other organizations? How are they looking to participate in that potentially more global marketplace for hydrogen?
Yeah, I would just, as I think about that question, Christine, I want to go back to a very important point that Case just made about, which parts of the market are using hydrogen, right? So he kind of named the big three, industry, heavy transport, and generation, and to be able to use the biomethane, for a lot of the building end use that exists today. You asked the regulatory question, and you asked some of the concerns about, how are our utility clients thinking about this? One of the things that's coming out of the policies that's very clear from the policymakers is we can't put the burden of this transition on disadvantaged communities, right? And there are parts of the community and parts of our society that cannot afford the technology changes, right? They can't afford to change out some of their equipment in the home use, and somebody needs to serve that market, and we can't have a disproportionate share of stranded costs going to those communities. So, I kind of, when we think about globally, I kind of bring it all the way back locally. How do I make that transition but not disadvantage those communities, right? How do I help those communities participate? How do we get to those mid-century goals and not penalize people who are not able to defend themselves?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a great point. And a lot of things we're seeing around, electrification more broadly as well. The costs and burdens there to be able to move towards this, more electrified future. All right. So, Case, do you have anything that you want to add around that in terms of that global marketplace that we're looking at? Some of these broader implications for the transportation.
Yeah. So really exciting developments there, because one of the cheapest sources of renewable electricity is, of course, solar PV now. In Portugal, here in Europe, we already have systems being offered for like $15 per megawatt hour or so. Same in the Middle East, but there's even sunnier places in the world. Of course, there's Australia, and there's the Atacama Desert in Chile, for example, which already sees some large solar PV development. And those regions are, of course, looking to export solar hydrogen now. They would probably do it by ship to many parts of the world. Then you get an analog to LNG market. But the thing is that transporting per pipeline is a lot cheaper, up to a couple of thousands of kilometers or miles, if you will. So there's also talk of how should you bring Australian renewable electricity to Asia? Should it be a huge high voltage DC connection for electricity? Should it be ships sailing with green hydrogen on board, either in a liquefied form? It's a little bit tougher than liquefying natural gas. You have to go even lower with temperature, or tied to molecules in liquid organic hydrogen carriers, or in the form of methanol, ammonia, I mean. But another option is to build a pipeline from Australia via Indonesia to the Asian demand centers. So it's a bit too early to call exciting development. From a European perspective, it could be attractive to import from North Africa. There's huge areas with a very high solar irradiation, and they are already connected by pipelines now, still transporting natural gas, but those fields will get depleted in the coming few decades. So they'd be available to feed into that European hydrogen backbone. And then you would have also very low cost of transportation. So that might be where it starts. But certainly I expect this to be at least a regional scale market, if not a global market in 20 years from now or so.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. How do you bring the energy to different parts of the globe, and what form does it take? So we've talked about transportation of hydrogen itself, but there's also the transportation piece of just vehicles that we're looking at, and mobility. And before we kind of get into some of our closing thoughts here, I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. I mean, we have electric vehicles, we have hydrogen vehicles. What does that all kind of look like? How does it play together? And Danielle, I'd love to hear a little bit from you about that in terms of what we're kind of seeing in that space when we look at transportation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important that we touch on this, because the transportation sector is definitely one where, hydrogen plays an interesting role. As we start to look at the decarbonization models and how this plays out, what we see is that there's a significant electrification of smaller vehicles, right? And we see that with the automakers and businesses, are making that decision to move in that direction. But when we look at those larger scale, heavier duty vehicles, that is a much bigger challenge in terms of electrification. In some cases, there aren't electric options out there. In some cases, just how they operate or how they function. Hydrogen fuel cells are definitely something that's being considered. Whether we're thinking about kind of construction vehicles or, maritime, transport. It's an interesting discussion going on in the U.S. because this is where it gets really complex from the interlapping of the utility and transportation world. Utilities have, natural gas utilities have not typically served transportation markets, but this is an opportunity for them to serve a market that they haven't had in the past, right? And so we've definitely been talking to our utility clients, especially those that sit around ports and are dealing with significant amount of maritime vessels and large heavy-duty vehicles, around what that opportunity might look like, because hydrogen will definitely play a role in those heavy-duty vehicle sectors.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think when we look at mobility and transportation, yeah, it's not necessarily to sell the small vehicles, but I mean there are a lot of the large vehicles as well. Case, what are you seeing in terms of kind of that technology aspect with the vehicles in terms of electricity versus hydrogen?
Yeah, so I agree with Danielle that the electric vehicles are becoming a very attractive option for most passenger cars. But then if you look at trucking, there's also quite some room for electric trucks. If you're talking light trucks or short distances, even heavy duty trucks on short distances, like logistics for supermarket chains, etc., you can see them going electric if batteries become even cheaper and the density of the power goes up. Long distance heavy duty trucking, that's a different game, and there I think the jury's still out. Maybe fuel cell trucks with hydrogen could be a fierce competitor for electric there, because you would have to take a truckload of batteries to operate for like 600-700 miles or so, which also costs you cargo space, of course. So that's for the road. But then, of course, we also have, as Danielle already indicated, we have shipping and aviation, of course. And there, to take aviation first, it's like 2.5% of global CO2 emissions, but it's 5% of global climate impact due to the indirect effects. So you will see that the world can't get around doing something about aviation either. And we have already seen that as part of the package to save our national airline here, KLM. They have signed up to having 14% zero emission fuels by 2030. So they need to do something. It's either going to be a type of biokerosene or it's going to be synthetic fuels, e-fuels. So this is an important driver to get that market of synthetic fuels going. And there you need hydrogen as well, because almost all synthetic fuels have a hydrogen component. Shipping, that's an interesting one. I think correctly, Danielle stated that utilities haven't played a role. They're starting to play a role, because many seagoing vessels are switching from heavy fuel oils to LNG now, due to the sulfur guidelines of the International Maritime Organization. If you switch to LNG, you could think about the next step to bio-LNG to get rid of the CO2 emissions as well. But there's also alternatives, other alternatives based on hydrogen, like engines running on ammonia. So also still a very interesting race developing there to decarbonize the shipping industry.
Yeah. I mean, I think this webinar has certainly highlighted for me all the different opportunities and directions that we can go with hydrogen. Now, I think just to close out here, we just have a few minutes left. What I'd love to hear from each of you is just, given kind of the big opportunities, the near-term perspectives that we're looking at, what can organizations be doing to really, kind of balance those near-term opportunities with some of these larger, longer-term opportunities that we're talking about? And I'll pick on you first, Mark. What are you thinking?
Yeah, I'm going to go back to where we started, Christine. I want to talk about change, right? If I'm a strategic planner at the company and you ask that question about when do we think we'll be investing or embracing hydrogen, and everybody had various, time periods in which they're thinking about doing it, what stakeholders want to know, what your investors want to know, what the communities want to know is, where do you sit in terms of a sustainable business model? That's what ESG is all about, right? Is trying to ask companies, how do you think about these changes? How are you making this transition? And if we're going to invest in you, if we're going to be part of your community, how do you take that journey, and will you be successful in doing it? So, I would encourage, our clients and the other folks that are attending this webinar to embrace the change. And it's scary, right? Change can be very scary. Danielle and I have been working on a white paper, and kind of, one of the fun questions we're asking ourselves is, do you want to be Blockbuster or Netflix, right? If you embrace change, right? I mean, somebody along the way said, well, gee, if I put this little disc in the mail and send it to you back and forth, they could watch more movies, right? And they made that transition from the big box where you went in and got your movie to where they are today. So embrace change. There's a lot of opportunity there. There's lots of jobs there. But, your stakeholders want to know, what are you doing to make that journey to the mid-century goals for decarbonization?
Yeah, definitely like that. Embracing the change. Danielle, how about you?
Yeah, and I'll be really quick here. It seems like we could spend all day talking about this topic, but I think the one piece of advice I would say is, don't take any option off the table too early. We have seen over the past couple of years very clearly something that we thought was expensive changes in the course of 2 or 3 years to something that's right back in the story. So for everyone that's looking at these transitions, keep your options on the table, don't write them off, and really think through what it means as the market changes, because I think things are moving quickly here.
Yeah, I like that. Keeping your options open. And Case, how about you? Just to close us out in the last 60 seconds, what should people be keeping in mind?
I was thinking of clients with very long life investments. There's a reason that we're working with those gas transport companies. They usually depreciate their assets in like 50 years, and they're a long-term stable source of income for their investors. But those investors are starting to ask questions like, "Hey, I read about that net zero, and I love your pipeline at the moment, but what's gonna do in 2050, right?" So they are already under some pressure to think about the life of their assets in 2050. That's where it starts. And same for a steel plant. If it's up for renewal of its installations this coming decade, they might say, "Oh, still business as usual, carbon price not too high," but they won't, because their investors and their owners will ask, "Okay, but this cute, but what's going to happen next decade, right?" So do you have a plan? And of course, investment is now still more expensive than a conventional installation, but then they can talk with government and say, "Hey, listen, we would love to stay in the Netherlands and not have to emigrate to some other part of the world. Can we talk about enabling this first toe in the water, this first conversion, so that we don't lose out on this natural reinvestment moment in the 2020s?"
Yeah, so definitely having those conversations, being open to change and, keeping those options on the table. Well, thank you so much, Mark, Danielle, and Case. This was a fantastic conversation. And thank you to the audience. You all had fantastic questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to them all, but you can definitely see a need to have further conversations around hydrogen. So thank you so much, and we hope everyone has a great day. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks all.